welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm Grace Johnson. I am the marketing manager here at Wheelhouse, and I'm going to provide just a little introduction before we get into content. And we will be diving into HIPAA-friendly advertising strategies for healthcare marketers today. And then here is our agenda. Like I said, be going through a quick introduction, privacy challenges recap before we get into the meat of our content. We'll review some data types and applications, the digital advertising challenge in healthcare, some optimization strategies for post-compliance, and then organizational implications. And then at the end, we will have a Q&A section. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop them into the Q&A box in your little menu bar below. And then we will get to them at the end of the presentation. And what you will gain today. So hopefully when you leave this webinar, you will have clarity on HIPAA's impact on digital advertising platforms, frameworks for leveraging first-party, third-party, and platform data effectively, and then approaches to testing alternative channels and stakeholder alignment. And just to give you a little bit of background on Wheelhouse, we are a world-class performance marketing agency for privacy-first industries, and we help our clients thrive by solving their toughest digital challenges. And we have a particular concentration in healthcare, medical device, and the insurance industries. And we've worked with some of the most innovative brands in those markets for more than a decade. And you can see some of those brands here. And then we've also worked with some of the world's most innovative brands for longer. So we don't just specifically focus on healthcare and medtech. We will work with other brands as well. And at Wheelhouse, our ability to consistently deliver value through a combo of our expertise, our purpose-built technology, our creative capabilities, they all enable us to maintain those long-term client relationships, and that's really what we value most. We have a variety of practices, which you can all see here, but we have the most success when we really tackle our clients' challenges from an all-inclusive perspective, and that's what we call our One Wheelhouse approach to privacy-first digital marketing. Right. And today your host is Michael Mears. He is a digital advertising analyst here at Wheelhouse, and he's known for his strategic approach to campaign optimization, which drives measurable results for our clients. And Michael is an excellent guide to cover HIPAA-friendly advertising strategies this afternoon. And I'm super excited to hand it over to him so we can dive right in. So Michael, off to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Grace. I'm excited to get into it today. We're going to start off with a little recap of where we are and what we're going, what we are up against, and then get on with it. In case you missed our first webinar in this series, we want to provide a short recap on the privacy challenges that have caused digital marketers in healthcare to have to pivot to more creative means of optimization and tracking and targeting and things like that. It all comes back from this OCR, Office of Civil Rights guidance, which fundamentally redefined PHI on digital. The definition at the top right of this is potentially HIPAA PHI is any individually identifiable information created or received by a HIPAA covered entity that relates to the past, present, or future physical or mental condition of an individual that is transmitted or maintained in electronic media or in any other form or medium. So what this means, and I'm sure this definition is familiar to you all, the critical implication is that virtually any digital interaction with healthcare content can create PHI, regardless of patient status. So what makes this particularly challenging is that the bulletin specifically targets standard marketing infrastructure. IP addresses are now definitive identifiers. User journeys relating to health conditions immediately become PHI, and third-party data combinations create compliance risks, even when your initial collection seems innocuous. So the impact is that a visitor that's browsing your specialty pages and just clicks the contact us button, for example, has generated PHI throughout their journey, even without submitting information, the interpretation of this has forced our industry to completely rethink our tracking and measurement approaches. The privacy compliance is leaving healthcare marketers in the dark coming out of this ruling. So there's three main challenges for us in digital marketing, and the first one being the regulatory landscape has tightened. We're restricted often from using default tracking pixels or analytics scripts in all the major platforms like Meta, Google Analytics, Google Ads, and you just can't share data with anything that doesn't require data sharing requires a BAA, so you can't share data with many of those major platforms. And then, because of this, compliance is turning the lights off on platform measurement, and some other forms of measurement as well, but generally on platform measurement is where it's going to get us the most. Um, so wanted to just before we get into the solutions and strategies to get through these challenges, let's talk about, what's in our toolbox, what most importantly, like let's define what data types we are working with. So three main types of data here. First party, platform, and third party data. So first party data, you know, pretty simple. It's data that you directly collect from your customers and audiences. It's often the most limited for us in this new world in terms of how we would have used to use it versus what we have to do now. And it's because it's the most restricted on the platforms. Most of the data that a company collects from its customers and audiences will not be allowed to be fed back into platforms because it's now considered PHI. Um, Despite all of these issues, it's, because this is where the issues are often coming from, it's still the most important part of the puzzle. And you should definitely have a strategy around collecting and utilizing your first party data where appropriate. Second, platform data. This is the data that lives completely on the platform, so the advertising platform. So think of things like clicks, impressions, video views, audiences built on these things, anything that belongs to the platform is going to be platform data. So we can use these things, pretty much at will, but it's, going to be a little bit, limited in what it actually is. Traditionally, platform data could also be something like, containing off-platform activities. So, you're thinking a conversion of a form on a website, you used to tie that back into a conversion in your ad platforms. Maybe would have considered that platform data in the past. You can't do that in a lot of cases in a privacy first landscape. And then finally, third party data. This is data that's just collected by another entity and is aggregated and sold to other companies, usually advertisers. These are often, still fair play and can be even more useful in this privacy first landscape. So let's go to some key differences between these different data types. I'm just going to go line by line here. The source is, it's in the name, first party, direct from users, you're collecting it yourself, platform data directly within the platforms, and third party, collected by a third party, external entities. Um, so the accuracy of these three, the first two are very accurate. You generally you can rely on your first party data. You've collected it. So it's yours. You know what it is. You can do whatever you want with it. I mean, you can't do whatever you want with it. You can manipulate it however you want. But like you know what it is, and it's accurate. Platform data, also very accurate, but can be limited in the types, as I was just discussing. Third party data is the difference here. So you just need to be careful. You don't know exactly how it's collected in some cases. You just need to be careful with what the difference is between the third party versus the first party, the differences between the different vendors. Sometimes the accuracy of this is not as high compared to a first party data or a platform data where that's generally very reliable. Control and privacy. This is a really important row. So you have control of your first party data and full responsibility for it as well. Whereas platform data and third party data, there's limited transparency and can have different privacy concerns, but in different ways. So that first party data, because you have full control of it, a lot of times you have full responsibility for it as well. And that's kind of what this is all about. Um, Attribution clarity. So they're at the third, right in the middle here, third from the bottom. So for attribution clarity with first party, this is what I was saying. You have full control over it because it's yours and you own it. You can use whatever attribution you want. It's manipulable, but so you can do what you want with it in terms of analysis and attribution. Platform data, generally reliable, but it just differs between the platforms. Just make sure you know within the platform that you're using, what's the attribution settings, change those to what you want them to be, but generally pretty reliable. Third party can be a little bit more inconsistent and just make sure as well that you know what you're working with. Um, Reach and scalability, second to bottom here. This one is also one of the most important ones, and is a key difference in the way that we get to use them. So first party data is generally limited in terms of reach and scale. You can scale it, and it can have reach, but it's limited because you're collecting it yourself. So it's not like you can just necessarily pay more and you suddenly have more, as it would be the case for third party, but it's yours. So generally not very scalable. Platform data, broad, very scalable, but maybe not as valuable as, for example, first party data. First party data where you can have, some robust data because you own it. But platform data, you may not be able to feed all the things you would have liked to. You might not have leads, you might not have sales or other patient info. So it's limited but scalable. And then third-party data can be really scalable, really broad, but and going to that last row, it's very expensive. So while it is broad and scalable, the more and more you scale it, the more and more expensive it gets. So that's an important consideration there. Platform data and first-party data are much lower cost, but generally I would say platform data, the cost is low, but it does require some activity on the platform, right? Like you have to generate the clicks and the impressions before you can, use that data in whatever way you're trying to use it. And first party data, after you have it set up and everything, very low direct cost because you're not having to pay anyone for it. But it can have a high setup cost just getting your strategy in place and the structure set up. But obviously it can be a super important investment. So now that we're on the same page on our types of data and the differences between them, let's dive into the challenge itself. So there's a couple key obstacles here when it comes to compliance. The theme with all of these is that there's just less data being able to be fed back into the platforms. So no IP address tracking, limited geographic data, lost customer journey insights, restricted behavioral data, and all of this leads into minimal optimization signals. The impact of this um, is the most obvious issue is the sourcing of audiences. You can't give the advertising platforms PHI, and that can put a halt to retargeting, to some things like nurturing and other strategies. And you can also be limited even in prospecting if you were, for example, previously building lookalikes based on lead info or something like that. Obviously you're not gonna be allowed to do that in a privacy first landscape. So that's a very important issue. Second, with most platforms, every platform, maybe most platforms, all the big ones being algorithmically driven at this point, pushing less data into the platform can be a pretty big disadvantage. You're just giving less data for that algorithm to use to find the customers that you're looking for. So because of that, at minimum, while you adjust, costs are going to be higher. Cost per acquisition can generally be higher, and for some, it can be a reasonable expectation that they're always going to be higher, even after you've figured it out and found a good strategy for you. But all in all, you just got to adjust. There's plenty of things to do here, and this will be the theme for the rest of the webinar. You just got to test and learn. You got to maybe rethink, retest, and relearn your strategies. Try different things. You can't just chop out the parts of your strategy that aren't allowed anymore and expect the rest of it to work just as it always was. So moving into some actual strategies, now that we've got this tools, we've got the challenge in front of us. What are we going to do about it? So the theme of this section, as I just said, is going to be testing and learning. Not every solution is going to work for every advertiser, but you can treat this as an opportunity to reset your strategy and come out on the top of this new challenge. So let's talk through some of the major platforms, starting with Google. The key with Google, even more so than with other platforms, is just keeping your eye on the final goal. On Google right now, even like outside of healthcare, outside of these privacy challenges, is that the theme is AI and expansion. There's search, which is expanding into broad and search max and and more, PMax, demand gen, whatever else. It's just all expanding, all AI. Google's gonna, take your keywords and expand them. They're gonna take your placements and expand them and whatever else. This has been a trend for many years, but now you add into that the addition of more limited signals being pushed back into the platforms. It can be even less performant than you might expect. So the first step when you're approaching Google is definitely making sure that your setup is maximizing the amount of info that you're sending back to Google compliantly. Even if you can't send user data back to Google, for example, maybe you can send a value of a different kind of lead versus another or something along those lines. This is going to vary case by case. The solutions are going to be custom and you need to figure out what works best for your situation. So I'm not going to go into, more specifics, but just generally, you want to make sure you're giving them as much info as you can or as you're allowed to. Explore solutions like server-side tracking, other privacy-first solutions that can get you into a better spot here. Second thing with Google is just testing while keeping your eye on the prize. With limited signals, PMAX and other automated features can still be really helpful and really successful within your strategy. Just test into them, follow the best practices, follow whatever your Google rep's telling you, and then see what happens. I will note though that generally with all these, with the algorithms driving everything and us giving less data to the platforms, the algorithms can get a little bit more wonky than maybe you would normally see. So, for example, on a search campaign, keep an especially close eye on search terms and things like that. They don't necessarily, you're not going to necessarily get to it as quickly as you normally would have. But that being said, with Google, we've had a lot of success getting back, to even the same results we had before with some compliant techniques and making sure we're testing and learning through all the new things. Um, Moving on to Meta. Broadly, okay, so for Meta and other social platforms, your goals don't have to change. Your campaign audience, conversion goals or actions might need to change. They might need to evolve, and you're going to need to test new approaches. But your final goal can remain the same and should always still be the barometer for success. Um, the theme here, just like Google, is making sure you're testing all you can. Test into all the things that you can. I mean, things even you maybe normally might have. Okay, so you can't do a lookalike based on leads, but maybe you can, run a video views audience and then retarget engagers of the video view campaign. That could be an interesting seed audience for a lookalike or something like that. Or work with a third party partner to figure out what other audiences could be available for you within the platform. There's plenty of options out there for getting back to qualified audiences and other methods of improving your efficiency. But even if you're not, even if those strategies aren't as successful in terms of getting back to a highly qualified audience, the good news with Meta, especially, is that the trend over the last couple of years has been creative is the new targeting. Meta doesn't want you to narrow down your audience. Meta doesn't want you to, pick a specific placement and something like that. So, while this kind of plays into our hand with compliance setups, where we're not necessarily going to be able to limit it. We're not allowed to limit it as much. But, if you use your creative as the targeting to try to get to your qualified audience, that can be really successful. We actually did a webinar on this a few months ago that my colleague Chelsea Keller did. And it was a really fantastic webinar. I would point you towards that if you wanted to learn more about creative is the new targeting. So diving into a little bit of a case study here, especially as it relates to Meta, is the data restrictions from the last year. So for many healthcare marketers, following this restriction, you can no longer track leads within this platform, and this can be really scary. This is something that was, I think it was an email in early December, and you said you had a month and you can no longer optimize or track towards leads. Obviously, very scary. All the fears on the left were very, very real. Everyone was feeling them. People thought, meta restrictions could kill healthcare marketing, that you won't be able to optimize towards bottom funnel events, that you wouldn't be able to use a pixel anymore, and then you weren't going to get any performance, and that cost would skyrocket, or that you should just delete your Meta account. These things are, these were the fears, but the reality is, while it is scary and you can't do something that you can't do things the way you normally do them, and it's jolting, you can, there's still plenty of options here for performance. You can optimize towards platform metrics like clicks or video views. You can try optimizing towards a content view on a landing page or a thank you page or something like that. You can test different optimization events and just see how it goes. The key here, as with everything, is just testing and learning. Test different optimization events, test different things to optimize towards on the platform. If even if you're still trying to drive leads through the platform, just make sure you're tracking it on your end, test and learn, iterate through your options, and see if you're able to get back to the performance you were. It's definitely very realistic. And even if you aren't able to drive leads like you used to be, you know, there's other options that you can do with social platforms. For example, you can decide that that's just going to fill a different part of your funnel. Maybe you want to drive awareness or engagement on the platform. In those cases, and with any case, throughout this, just treat it like you would any other platform. This is a bit of a new platform in a lot of ways. So just determine what your KPI is, test into it. May not be a winner, but it might be. So it's just a good reminder generally as well as you're going through all of these is just to try to structure your tests as best as you can to learn the impact of your campaigns. Minimize those variables as best you can. The goal here should just be, testing through all the things, learning about all of them, and seeing what works for you. But generally, I would say the fear were not the reality here. You can adjust and get back to where you were. And then finally, as I talk about, kind of rethinking your overall strategy, it's a good idea to reevaluate some of your legacy decisions. Explore, alternative platforms that maybe you weren't considering before. Maybe they can play a new role within your structure. Yeah, I'm not saying that, a Snapchat or a TikTok will necessarily have any better options in terms of targeting compliantly or performing compliantly or anything like that, but you can still use them for different purposes within your structure. It's just an opportunity to, rethink what you were doing, reevaluate your spend. If Meta isn't driving leads anymore and they're pivoting to awareness, maybe TikTok will, drive awareness just as well or better. Just some options to keep in mind. Um, and then lastly here, I wanted to talk about the organizational implications here. It's a pretty big challenge that many advertisers have been facing is how to communicate throughout your organization and then organize your team around these hurdles that we're tackling. So first, internally, these are the things that you and your team should be on the same page about. So first, you want to get your setup squared away. I kind of talked about this a little bit in the data types part and the data types section, but you need to invest in your first party data systems and into server side tracking. You want to have full control of your data, and you'll be able to send as much data compliantly as you can back into the platforms for optimization. Second, and this is the sad one, understand that with many privacy first approaches, the low costs of the past are gone. You may need to reset some goals. That's not to say that you can't still meet your goals strategically, but you're generally not going to see that same super low CPAs that you may have once saw. Um, Third is vendor assessment. This was a super important part of it, and it's new in a lot of ways because you need to learn how to work with BAA and non-BAA entities. You need to be able to understand what they can do for you, what they're allowed to do, what you can use it to do, what kind of data you can send to a third-party vendor. You just need to be prepared for a deeper search into vendors than maybe you once saw. And then finally, and this one will tie into the next slide as well, is education. Marketers and their other stakeholders need to understand the implications of the rising costs and generally like our more limited options in this privacy first landscape. This is a new world for us all and for many, and so it's going to be really important to make sure you and your team and the broader stakeholders know what your options are. Speaking of those broader stakeholders, I just wanted to talk for a moment about educating broader stakeholders. This is going to be extremely important for your success. You need to make sure you're setting the groundwork so that everyone understands all the things that are affecting you today broadly within your organization and with other stakeholders. So the first thing is to build an organizational mindset that prioritizes patient safety. Many organizations have that mindset elsewhere, but you need to bring that within digital marketing because that's where we're headed. This doesn't mean that you need to deprioritize growth or performance. You can prioritize those all together, but just make sure privacy is also there at the forefront. If you do that and you do it well, compliance can become a competitive advantage. You've got to put the time and you got to put the resources behind it. But when some other players in the market are not, you can have an advantage. You can build that muscle early. So for many, if you're building that muscle, this can be a really big turning point for your organization. And then finally, you may need to develop alternative performance metrics that don't rely on that same level of individual tracking that you maybe once did. For example, maybe picture a company where you're only interested in driving leads and you're looking at leads and you used to be able to tie it to some sort of PHI, maybe you were tying it to like an IP address or something. you maybe need to rethink what that looks like in terms of, your reporting, in terms of your optimization. Um, and for example, in that case, it might make more sense to zoom out and look at phone calls, or look at broadly that total top line number of leads, or leads within a geographic area that's not as limited to or within this HIPAA compliant context. This new world doesn't have to be any less performant, but it's certainly going to look different than others. You just need to bring those broader stakeholders along with you as you're going through this process, and getting back on top. Um, that is generally what I wanted to cover today, so we'll move on into the Q&A section.
Wonderful. Awesome. Thank you, Michael. We did have some questions come through as you were running through. So we're going to start with this first one here. Where should we start if we're currently non-compliant?
Well, the first thing I would do is reach out to a company that knows what they're doing, or work with your legal team to decide where you need to be. Um, Wheelhouse does this, other companies do this, but you just need to, that should be your first step, is to start to do it compliantly, because there's some risks that are involved when you're doing these things non-compliantly.
Yes. And you also mentioned previous webinars that we have too. I can send those out in the recording link that I'll send at the end of the webinar as well, so that everybody can have access to those resources. Okay, wonderful. Next question. Which alternative platform should we prioritize when testing for healthcare advertising?
That's a good question. I don't think that, it's a bit of a tough one. It's going to differ from situation to situation. I would say that generally, like, some of the bigger ones can have a lot of options, the TikToks and the Snapchats of the world. But generally, for you, it's going to look different based on your goals and the audiences you're trying to reach.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. And then this question, I believe, came in when we were here on this slide. Someone asked, does this information apply to social media?
Yes, this definitely applies to social media. That is a key platform here. I would say the social media will, especially, that middle row platform data, that can often live on social media, for example, on Meta. But also, first party data and third party data are definitely extremely applicable in this case as well.
Thank you. Okay, and then maybe one more coming in. Oh, maybe not. All right. Well, as I mentioned, thank you everybody for joining today. I will be sending out the recording of this webinar, and we will be sharing it on our website as well. So you can always refer back or reach out if you have any questions or want to talk further on any of these topics. I included Michael's email here if you want to get in touch. Oh, we just had another question pop up. I do want to come back to this, but again, I'll keep this contact info up here. Again, reach out, please, if you have any questions. But this question just came in through Q&A. How can ad tech platforms help teams stay compliant?
That is a good question. Krista, do you have an answer that comes to the top of your head on this one? I think my instinct initially would be, just working with your legal teams to figure out what exactly is, out there, what can you do, and then working, with your teams to leverage that tech for, pushing as much data to the platform as you think
Yeah.
is, acceptable, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that is a great question. It's a little bit outside of this, but we work with a few different ad tech platforms with different clients. So I think if there's one specifically, or you want to email Grace, we could get back to you in a more comprehensive um, response to that. But they can, if you're talking about them kind of looking and dicing or de-anonymizing data around those areas. So there's a few that do that and can help in that, but would totally be happy to answer that fully if you had some that you were looking at and weren't sure of.
Wonderful. Okay, perfect. And it looks like we will get an email. So thank you very much.
Great.
All right. Wonderful. Okay. Thanks again, everybody. We appreciate you taking the time. We will be in touch with the recording of this webinar, and we hope this was helpful.